Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to everybody at home as well, sitting in your nice, comfortable rooms with a cup of tea. How is everybody? Oh, am I unmuted? I am.
You are. I'm just moving the camera. Oh, you're not on that camera. That's my fault.
One moment.
To plug you in. Hang on.
Okay. Hi, good evening, everybody. Everybody here and everybody at home. Right, I've got one new member to welcome, Paul Jaskolski of Slough, and I know he's not here, but welcome to Paul anyway, and I hope he might be watching at home. I'm not sure that he is, but anyway, welcome to Paul. Right, the photographic competition, Jane has received several entries, she says, but the closing date is Friday, March the 8th. So you've got another something like 12 days or whatever it is, I think 2 weeks perhaps, to get your photographs in. Yes, one moment. Pardon?
We were having a Zoom with 3 or 4 friends who are photographers, all with BOC Association on Monday night.
Yeah.
And we were arguing about the second group of images, flight and action. Some people were thinking it was flight with action on a flying bird.
Right.
Or some people were thinking it's either flying birds or a bird on the ground or on the ground doing something.
Oh,
is there
gosh.
an agreement or a...
I'm so sorry, everybody at home. Sorry. There seems to be a bit of discussion about the categories of the photographic competition. It's flight.
It's flight and action,
flight
I think.
and action, isn't
I
it?
was going to suggest, for those of you at home, there's just a question come up about one of the categories on the photographic competition, flight and action. Jane is coming tonight, isn't she?
I thought she was. I don't know where she is.
Assuming that Jane, who's organising it, should be here. Assuming she is, can we ask her to try and answer that later? Maybe at the break or something. Okay.
Yeah. I think she's going to be late.
Because otherwise, I could probably come up with an answer, but I think it's probably best ask Jane.
Yeah, there were 2 or 3 different opinions.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
So I was just going to say, if you can keep the paper a little bit lower,
All right,
if that's possible.
Yes.
You're hiding yourself behind the paper.
Okay. Right. Sorry, everybody at home. Right. Okay. Right. Meetings. The next indoor meeting here is on Wednesday, the 6th of March, and it's the Nest Record Scheme, which is being spoken by Lee Barber. And on March the 20th is the photographic competition, which is in a month's time. And as I said, the closing date for entries is Friday, March the 8th. And we will clarify the categories when Jane comes in, hopefully a bit later this evening, in case anybody is a bit doubtful about the flight and action one, although details are on the website. The next BOC outdoor trip is on Saturday, the 9th of March, and it's a day trip to Kent, led by Robert Godden. The NDOC meetings, the next one is indoors. The indoor one, sorry, is on Thursday, the 14th of March, and it's Australia by Richard Stansfield. And their outdoor trip is on Saturday, the 24th of February, which is a morning walk at Greenham Common. That's this Saturday, I think, isn't it? And then Reading RSPB, their indoor meeting is on Tuesday, the 12th of March, and it's a bird walk to Hell, H-E-L, Birding the Polish Baltic Coast by Jonathan Forgem. He's always very entertaining to listen to, and he's coming back in the next season. The outdoor trip is on Sunday, the 17th of March, which is a minibus trip to Blashford Lakes. Now, the Woking and Bracknell RSPB group, their indoor meeting is on Thursday, the 14th of March, and it's Lincolnshire's Birds and Reserves by Stephen Lovell, or Lavelle, which I believe we've had actually a couple of years ago. And their outdoor trip is on Sunday, the 17th of March, which is a day trip to WWT Barnes, which is the London Wetlands Centre. Right. Okay. Has anybody seen anything exciting? Bird-wise. Anybody seen anything unusual? No, I haven't, I'm afraid. Nothing outstanding. Anything on the internet, Sally?
I haven't. Any of the. I'm just looking at. No, I can't see anybody on Zoom.
No.
Putting a hand up.
Okay, so not much. Oh, Neil.
Well, no, there's, you know, there's a lot of flooding around at the moment.
A lot of flooding, yes.
And therefore, there will be quite a few both little and great white egrets popping up in various places. Like
Okay.
Dartmoor, there's one, two, I think, between Pangbourne and Burley.
Neil is saying there are a lot of little and great white egrets around, Burley and Pangbourne.
Amongst the other, the Padworth floods took place to be huge numbers of lapwing.
Huge numbers of lapwing at Padworth floods.
Possibly, in my view, one of the most remarkable, two remarkable records. First one, actually on the ground bit, there were 64 pintail.
Wow.
Middle of last week. By the end of the week, I went out and have a look. There's a 39 there.
Okay.
Down again.
So firstly, there were 64 pintail at Padworth again, you said. Padworth at Lane Gravel Pit, 64 pintail.
I think it's the second highest count ever for the county.
Second highest count ever for the county.
And Ken Moore has told me there was also a goosander on a flooded field there, which is quite remarkable. You think of a goosander as being on deep water.
Okay.
The floods of Padworth.
So a goosander on a flooded field there, rather than being on deep water where it might usually be, it was on a flooded field. Goosander. Okay, thank you, Neil. Right, nobody else? Right, leaves me to introduce Kevin, who hopefully is waiting in the wings to join us. And I can't blame him for not driving from Devon. It's a heck of a journey, isn't it, there and back. He lives on the edge of Dartmoor, and he and his wife manage 150 acres of woodland and meadows there, which sounds idyllic. I'm sure it has its moments, but it sounds fabulous. Now, Kevin, I'm sure he's familiar to most of us, is the Chair of Council RSPB, and he's involved with Woodland Trust as a council member and a member of the BTO, WWT and Devon Wildlife Trust, amongst other conservation organisations. So he's probably kept quite busy, I'm sure. And tonight we're going to hear about species recovery with examples of UK and overseas birds. So I would like us all to welcome Kevin to our meeting this evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sue, and hello everyone. I wouldn't have said if you'd been here today it was terribly idyllic. It was pouring with rain most of the time. So though I did see a goshawk over the woods displaying, which was always a treat when they come round. So I'm going to share my screen and but I wanted to start just to pay tribute to a very good friend of mine, a very good friend I know of many of you, Renton Rigolato. I first met Renton, I think 20 plus years ago now, when he was chair of Woodland Trust, and I joined the Council of Woodland Trust, and he was, as I'm sure many of you know, he was always incredibly welcoming. I learned a huge amount from him, not just around chairing meetings, and I think he was an excellent chair, but he was also a great scientist. He was a great communicator. He had a broad love of a whole range of things, not just birds, though he was a fanatical birder, but of opera, of the arts. And here he is up on Dartmoor with me some years ago, where we were looking for the most southerly population and I can never remember whether it's Cowberry or Crowberry. Renton would have remembered, but we didn't find it anyway. But we still had a fantastic day wandering around. So this is Renton out in Ecuador. On the left is a good friend of Nigel Simpson, who set up Fundación Hocotoco in Ecuador and was at school with Renton, good school friends, also involved with Woodland Trust. In the middle, you can see Niels Krabbe, who wrote the book, The Birds of the High Andes. There's me, looking a bit younger, and my friend Alan Martin, who's a former treasurer of the RSPB and former chair of the BTO. So we had some great trips together. That one was looking for this bird, which is the Hocotoco antpitter, which started really the Fundación Hocotoco in Ecuador, which now has over 20 reserves, amazing places. sadly, Ecuador's not quite the easiest place to go and visit at the moment. Here's Renton, also in Ecuador, standing by a massive tree. He was always looking to do carbon analysis. He loved everything about the environment, and it was always great to be out with him wherever it was, whether in this country or overseas, simply because he was an amazing man to learn from. Sometimes, though, we did get lost and we didn't get the birds. Here he is taking us looking for three-toed woodpecker in Finland, again with our friend Alan, which we failed to see. It's a bit of a story around that. But we did get some fantastic birds, and some of which you're going to see a bit later on in the talk. So I just wanted to start by paying tribute to Renton, to mention his overseas work, his enthusiasm, and of course all of you will know the support that he gave over decades to Berkshire Ornithological Club. It was very much part of his DNA. So I'm going to start, and I should really start with a bit of a trigger warning. Just going to say, I'm afraid this talk has a couple of things in it. One is, be warned, there's some pictures of dead birds, but more than that, there are quite a few graphs. Normally, I try to keep graphs well away from any talk that I give, but in this case, you're going to have to bear with me on that. And the first of these is what the RSPB uses as part of its scientific method, which is the species recovery curve. And you can see there are 4 parts of this. The diagnosis, why, when we know through monitoring that species are declining, looking for the reasons for those declines, then testing some of the solutions. Once we work out which solutions work, you can start to see that recovery, and then the hope is that you move into the long-term legacy where it doesn't need the sort of direct intervention that we normally do. Sally, I'm sorry, but doesn't seem to, that's okay, got it. Move on. So I wanted to talk very briefly about 3 examples of that where that model has worked. And of course, the first of those is this bird, the bittern, which many of you will know was down 30 years ago to the last 11 breeding pairs in the UK. And part of that, you know, the alarm bells were ringing that bittern could go extinct as a breeding bird. And RSPB pulled out all the stops. Clearly, as a wetland bird, a lot of that was related to wetland creation, and much of the wetland creation that RSPB has been involved with over the last 30 years. Places like, for example, this Laken Heath in Cambridgeshire, which before the work that the RSPB did was just carrot fields. They were worked out carrot fields, and now it's one of the best sites, I think, in the country, wetland sites for so many species. And of course, bittern is one of those. And if you look at the graph from 1990, those 11 pairs have now gone up to over 200 males. So you can hear booming bittern now across the country. And I think much of that was working out what it was that they needed, clearly wetlands, but it was also about the depth of those wetlands, the amount of food in those wetlands, and the broader ecosystems as well. And there's a great paper here from 10 years ago in British Birds about the work that the RSPB did on managing and recreating wetlands in Britain. That for potential colonists, but of course many of our other birds, including bittern, have benefited from that. And here, glossy ibis, occasional breeders been down at Ham Wall, but many other things. We heard about great white egret 10 years ago, still a rarity, now becoming much more common. We're seeing big numbers of cattle egret, for example. Another bird and a different problem here, the crane, the common crane, went extinct 400 years ago, back in the 16th century, over 400 years ago, probably because Henry VIII ate most of them. hunting, drainage of wetlands, whole range of things had driven them to extinction. Of course, a few came back in Norfolk, but they weren't expanding. And the decision was taken that the only way to rebuild a population of common crane in the UK was to bring eggs over from East Germany, mostly, and from Eastern Europe, and then to hatch them over here and to rear them. You can see here one of the methods of rearing some of the chicks so that they weren't imprinted on their human parents. The humans dressed as cranes in order to make sure the cranes, clearly, we can see that's a crane. The cranes thought it was a crane, and now we have a thriving wild population. This on the Somerset levels. This is at West Sedgemoor, where the cages were put up, and clearly the cranes were taught to fend for themselves. And now there's and including, as you can see here, again, artificial cranes put in places to show the young cranes where the safest places were. And now a thriving population of common crane can be seen, not just in the Somerset levels. They're breeding at Dartmoor, they're breeding in Wales, also breeding in Scotland now. So crane is coming back. And again, I'm sorry, another graph, but it gives you an indication of the rapid increase of the number of cranes that are now breeding and the numbers that have been fledged each year. So it's still slow, but again, so diagnosing the problem, testing the solution, in this case reintroduction, and then getting them to that third level where they still need help, they still need the habitat created, but we're seeing significant increases year on year of the numbers of cranes. Another bird close to me, I mean, this Cirl Bunting. Cirl Buntings were reasonably common before the war, if you drew a line between the sort of the Severn and the Wash. And then gradually people noticed that they were disappearing post-war, but there was no real understanding of what the drivers of that decline were. So again, RSPB moved 25, 30 years ago now to start to do the science behind this, to look at the reasons for that decline. There were all sorts of hypotheses about that, including whether or not they were being outcompeted by yellowhammer, closely related, another bunting, of course, and people were seeing more yellowhammers at the time. We know they're declining now as well, and Cirl Buntings disappearing until there were only around 100 pairs left in that strip along the South Devon coast. And it became clear from the work that was done that the biggest driver was agricultural change. And along the south coast of Devon, there was still mixed farming. There were hedgerows that were billowing out that gave Cirl Buntings a place to nest. But actually what was really driving the decline was a change away from stubble, being left in fields over the winter, of mixed farms, and the birds, even if they were breeding, were then dying because of want of food in the winter. So working with local farmers, using agri-environment schemes. Here's Kath Jeffs, one of the RSPB agricultural farming advisors, talking to one of the farmers down in near Teignmouth in Devon. And we've seen since that work was done a significant increase in the number of Cirl Buntings. So you can see 1989 around 100 pairs, 2016 there were over 1,000 pairs, and they've spread. I don't know if you can see my cursor to even North Devon. Since then they're breeding on Portland in Dorset, and here on the Roseland Peninsula in Cornwall was a reintroduction, the first ever reintroduction of a passerine in Europe of Cirl Buntings, which are now thriving there. And of course, the hope is that gradually these two populations will meet. So reintroduction alongside the diagnosis of the problem. And while we haven't seen anything like the numbers as you would have seen back in the 1930s, I would suggest that Cirl Bunting is now at least secure along those areas where agriculture and farming supports it, and where there's winter food and the right sort of hedgerows. The problem, of course, is that you can never be sure that agriculture won't change again. So we are ever vigilant on this. So as I say, that was 2016, which was the last full survey, and there were then over 1,000 pairs. I really think that I'm hoping that when the next survey is done, we could see a significant increase on that. So talking of farming, I wanted to take you quickly to Hope Farm. This is the RSPB's farm in Cambridgeshire. It's 181 hectares. This is Georgie Lack, who is the farm manager. She works for the RSPB. She runs the farm, and the whole point of this farm is that it's not organic, but what we wanted to use it as was both a demonstration to other farmers how you can farm profitably and restore nature, and as a demonstration site and a test site for many of the interventions that we want to see in order to be able to bring back nature-friendly farming to these sorts of very, very intensively farmed areas. So the Hope Farm project, it was purchased in '99. The first phase of that was, again, as I said, demonstrating profitable, sustainable farming alongside nature, and then using it as a research centre for new ways to improve habitat for a whole range of species. And one of the changes that we've instituted is it has gone completely pesticides free 5 years ago, or 6 years ago now, from 2018. And a lot of the work, and I'm going to show you, is looking at how we can also farm so it reduces the impact on nature. So these are some of the things. If you go to Hope Farm, and they do an open day every year, but there are also footpaths running through. You won't see it all, but it's a fascinating place because what you can see is the conservation of existing species-rich habitats, some of the hay meadow sides. The field boundaries have completely changed. There are not just bigger hedgerows, which are still managed on rotation, but managed properly now, but wider margins. There's food for wintering birds, flowers for pollinators that have helped with crop production and increased yields. Obviously, water on the farm. Cambridge is incredibly dry, unlike Devon. And then the farmed areas, and you'll see those strips in there, and I'll come on to those. So the planning around the farm was all around how do we increase the areas for biodiversity at the same time as looking at using the areas that are high yield for farming, so you can be productive, you can be profitable, and you can increase the amount of biodiversity. One of those crops we all know is oilseed rape. And while here you know it's still a profitable crop, but it's being grown in ways that will support insects and then some of our migrants like whitethroat. So again, it's not just seeing the crop as a resource, but a resource for species that are coming back as well. And I'll show you what's happened to some of those species numbers. When you saw those strips down the field, it's a newish, about 4 years ago, Georgie and her team decided to move into what's called alley cropping. So you can see these rows in there, and those rows have been planted up with fruit trees and with nut trees. Multiple benefits. You can then have, as you can see in this picture, you can have species-rich margins running down the middle. It's helped with creating beetle banks. The beetles are predators. The beetles then are controlling many of the pest species. And of course, you're getting another crop. So if the main crop doesn't do so well, you still can, once they've grown up, you can rely on another crop, the apples and the nuts. So high value farming, what we call, it's 3D farming. So you're not just farming one crop as a monoculture, but actually using the land above as well for other crops. So this is it from the air, and you can see how much those flower-rich margins have grown in that time as the trees are growing up. And this is the Hope Farm Breeding Bird Index. Everything is monitored there, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the blue line at the bottom shows you the UK trend for farmland birds. Not great. We all know that farmland birds have declined more than many other species, many other assemblages of species. But at Hope Farm, there has been a significant increase. Of course, weather is variable and therefore things go up and down, changes to crops. But overall, the graph is showing increase, particularly of species like skylarks. It was here that skylark plots were first developed. So leaving bare areas on the ground and not seeding them when the crop is sown, so that the skylarks move into that and then have protection from predators as the rest of the crop grows up around them. And the number of skylarks, as you can see, has increased significantly over the 16 years, and I'm sure will have done again. But it's a bit like we're talking about Cirl Buntings. It isn't just breeding birds, it's about wintering birds and providing both the habitat and the food for birds over winter. So a significant increase, a massive increase over the last 20 years of the number of birds that are wintering on the farm. And I've been there in the winter, and it's quite astonishing. You walk through the hedgerows and birds are just flying out in vast numbers. The food's there, particularly the cover crops and the winter bird feed. Not just birds, of course, but other species as well. So monitoring of butterflies, and again, significant increase in butterfly numbers, obviously affected by weather when they get hit by wet summers. But overall, the graph is going up, unlike the blue line, where you're looking at what's happening to butterflies overall in England. So I said that a lot of monitoring goes on. Scientists are using this. I won't go through all of this. All I'll say is we're pretty much using Hope Farm to monitor everything. And what you're looking at the bottom picture is what's called a flux tower. So it isn't just biodiversity monitoring, that's monitoring carbon and soil carbon as well. So we're looking at ways to make farming more climate friendly, as well as increasing biodiversity. And just to show you one last picture of Hope Farm, here's within the alleys. The alleys are wide enough that here a crop of barley is being harvested late season, and then that much of that will be left for winter birds after the crop has been harvested. And because we're growing crops of high value, we're also then seeing profitability increase on the farm as well. So I wanted to quickly talk to you about swifts. Swifts is a bird very close to my heart, and I'll talk about the project that I'm involved with in Devon very briefly. Again, on the red list, massive decreases, 60% decrease since 1995. It's a bird in trouble, and we know the reasons why swifts are in trouble. It's mostly around housing no longer being suitable, many of the nesting sites, but also decreases in insect numbers. We've all seen that, and again, that's related to land use and changes to agriculture. So getting both of those things, providing nest sites for birds, this is again the long-term trend in a graph that you can see, and that 60% decline, 10-year change 40%, and even over the last 5 years we've seen a 20% decline in the number of swifts. This is a bird in real trouble. That is a cliff edge for swifts, and this is a bird that all of us know. They're part of our urban landscapes, our towns, our villages, and a bird that really does say summer here for such a short period of time. Just to give you from my home county what's happening in Devon, you can see graphically here the decline. We're just, and so many of these, and I've seen obviously the Berkshire breeding birds, or the Berkshire Atlas as well, and much the same is happening across Berkshire, across the country. So we've got a project at the moment to put swift boxes in the bell towers of churches. This is a church in Devon. I can't actually remember which one, but it's one that recently we put boxes in behind the louvers in the bell tower. there's a lot of evidence, other people have been doing this across the country, that birds, provided you pay the acoustic lure to bring them in, will start to use churches because they're high, they're within those urban townscapes pretty quickly. So over the last 6 months, we've now installed boxes in 12 churches, and I've been up and down belfries and the church towers across, particularly around Dartmoor and the South Hams. So if you know people, and this is the person who's completely transformed that project. It's a guy called Jerry Horn. He's a carpenter. He's also got a much better head for heights than I have. And he is absolutely passionate about swifts. And you can see some of the boxes that he's put up behind the louvers in one of the bell towers in a church in Devon. I think this is just transformational for swifts. And I'm really hoping we can use this as a way of not just turning around the fortunes of swifts, but also encouraging more people to put up swift boxes on their houses, in churchyards, to leave longer areas, to create habitat and to create the food for swifts for that 3-month period when they're here. So I'm going to take you to Dartmoor now very quickly. This is Holme Moor on Dartmoor. This is just up above where I live. It's not always like this. It certainly wasn't like this today, and I'll show you a picture later of what it was like on Sunday when I was up there, which was also pretty grim. But there are some nice days, and it's a beautiful area. But birds are not doing well on Dartmoor either. This is one of my favourite birds, the whin-chat. Again, a bird which has declined steeply across the country. We've lost, since the 90s, mid-90s, over the last 30 years, we've lost pretty much half of our whin-chats. And what we've seen is that they have retreated to upland areas, whereas if you go on the continent, of course, whin-chats can be found in farmed areas and on farmland and on the edges of villages and so on. That's no longer the case here. Again, agricultural change has moved them to the uplands. But we're seeing so many birds that would have been around our farm landscapes and around our rural areas have really only found refuge in places like Dartmoor. I always say, the classic example of that is the meadow pipit. You won't find meadow pipits anywhere now in Devon other than on Dartmoor, but they're not called upland pipits. They're called meadow pipits, and that's where they should be. But we've lost 97% of our meadows since the war. So this is Holme Moor, where the trees were from the air. Have a look at that reservoir, because you're going to see a map in a minute, but it gives you an idea. Can't quite see, it's not as flat as it looks in this picture. That green belt running to the north of the reservoir is the Dart Valley. Fantastic area for summer migrants for many of our woodland birds, and I'll come on to those in a minute. But the area we're looking at is at the front of the screen, that open area with scattered trees, with bracken, with some heather, not as much as there should be, and some bilberry. But if you look at that and look at the reservoir, which is here, so the purple areas around here are the areas where whin-chat are still hanging on, where we've had records of whin-chat. And if you look at the map on the right-hand side, the green areas are where the bracken is. So that correlation between whin-chats and areas of bracken and scattered trees is really important. And that's an area where that wasn't really recognised before in our uplands, but over the last 3-4 years, a number of the RSPB conservation scientists, well, one in particular has been working on Dartmoor, but there's also been work going on in the North Pennines at Geltsdale RSPB Reserve up there. But the work on Dartmoor has now shown exactly the sort of habitat, particularly on Dartmoor, that you'll find whin-chat. So it's steep-sided valley systems, scattered trees with some bracken cover, but also having heather and bilberry as part of that mix. So there's food, there's cover, there are songposts, and of course the whin-chats will use that. And what you're seeing here is a 2-page sheet that was produced based on the monitoring and the survey work, and that was, as you can see at the bottom left of the screen, some habitat sampling went on throughout one season 2 years ago. One of the scientists was up there measuring height of bracken, height of vegetation, type of vegetation, and so on. And now we've now been able to do is to give recommendations to farmers and the commoners on Dartmoor about the type of habitat that should be maintained. And including in that, and this was a picture that I took just at the weekend, so it was a misty, murky, wet day. In the middle of the picture, you can see a valley mire, which was re-wetted about 4 years ago and has been incredibly successful. Now has a pair of breeding snipe on there. But above that, there's been agreement from the commoners to plant 100 scattered trees, which will be put in these cactus guards, which keep the stock off. And that has only happened because of the evidence base that's been presented from the work that the RSPB conservation scientist Rob Hawkes did over the last couple of years. There's a peer-reviewed paper coming out very shortly on that. So I'm going to take you to a bit of my wood. This is on the edge of Dartmoor. It's classic upland oak wood. As you can see here, it's a plantation on an ancient woodland site. So you've got all those indicator species on the valley floor. The bluebells are here. There's wood sage. There's a whole range of really nice species. But look at the trees. The trees are planted. They were planted about 120 years ago after the woodland was taken down. There was a lot of mining in this area, and they've grown up straight. It's a beautiful piece of woodland, but the number of nesting opportunities for whole nesting birds is very limited, particularly for this bird, which is probably my favourite bird. Anybody who can see behind me, I've got a painting of pied flycatchers, and when we moved here 17 years ago, I did obviously a survey to look for pied flycatchers. The habitat looks right, everything's here, the way it's managed, the insect numbers, not a single pied flycatcher in that first year. And I think that was a lack of nesting opportunities, no holes in those trees. They're not old enough, they're not veteranized, that we haven't got the number of really older oak trees that usually pied flycatchers need to nest in. So we put up nest boxes. In the first year, we put up about 10 nest boxes, and the next year we got 2 pairs. Now I've got in total over 250 nest boxes throughout the whole woodland. You can see the woodland here. We've got bat boxes, we've got tawny owl boxes, tree creeper boxes, but most importantly, we've got boxes for pied flycatchers, and we monitor them every year. We ring where we can, the adults and all the pulley. So we've now got a complete picture of what's happened. And you can see from 2011, where we really started ringing the birds and there were enough, when we had 6 pairs, to last year where we had 32 pairs of pied flycatchers. And since then, we've also been working with other local woodland owners, and that 32 pairs is over 60 in the valley system along the edge of Dartmoor. So, and again, last year we fledged over 156 pied flycatcher chicks. Are we reaching capacity? Probably close, and that's why I'm making sure that we're putting up boxes in other local woodlands as well. It's all about connections. Places in isolation won't work. And one of the pieces of work the RSPB has been doing, particularly one of the senior principal conservation scientists, Malcolm Burgess, who also lives on Dartmoor, who runs something called the Pied Fly Net, encouraging people to put up nest boxes to monitor them, has been around geolocators. So we now know where the birds go in the winter, so you can see what's happening with pied flycatchers, things that previously, for all the ringing, we never, I think, in the last 100 years, there were 2 recoveries of pied flycatchers from Africa. in that whole time. Now with geolocators, we can pinpoint pretty much exactly where those birds are going, and it's all in West Africa around Sierra Leone, Liberia. And Malcolm and another scientist, RSPB scientist Fraser Bell, have been doing work out there on wintering populations of pied flycatchers as well. This is in West Africa, and this is the sort of habitat that you would expect to find pied flycatchers in the winter. So it's quite open. It's not like closed canopy woodland areas that you'll see them in this country. I just want to quickly mention again an area where science has helped us to understand, if not yet to work out ways to recover the birds. We've seen significant declines, as many of you will know, on chaffinch and on greenfinch over the last 20 years. And primarily it's because of disease, and I'm going to come on to disease in a minute. Trichomoniasis has really impacted both of those finch species quite hard. Sadly, this bird is suffering from it. It affects the windpipe, and then the birds die because they can't feed and they can't breathe. So here's a graph, I'm afraid, again, that shows you a little bit of what's happened to both of those two species. And all I'd say is there is one solution to this. None of us is going to stop feeding the birds. I feed the birds, but actually diligence around cleaning the areas, cleaning the feeding equipment is really important. It's that balance between not feeding and therefore not maintaining bird populations over winter, but ensuring that they are clean and that therefore protected from disease. So I'm going to come on to more disease, afraid. This is a picture I took of kittiwake in northern Norway. Get that right, it was in Norway. A big population there on one of the trips that Brenton, Alan and I made a few years ago, back in 2016. Arctic skua, you're going to see a bit of a trend with this. Guillemots here, great skua. This I think I took in Falshoek up in near Aberdeen in Scotland, RSPB Reserve, fantastic site, gannet colony. And of course, all of those species have been hit hard by bird flu, by HPAI. And avian influenza, highly pathogenic avian influenza. We are seeing, particularly with gannets, significant declines of many of our most important gannet populations. So this table will show you on the left-hand side, you can see what was happening to many of those populations prior to avian influenza. Gannet numbers were going up. And as were great skua numbers. A lot of other species, and for some of the reasons I'll come on to in a minute, were declining anyway. But if you look at the left-hand column, you can see what's really happened. Gannet numbers, population levels have declined by 1/4, great skua by 3/4. I mean, this has been an absolute disaster for many of our already under pressure seabird colonies. And all of those, and I'm sure everybody here will have visited one of our great seabird colonies, whether it's Falshoek or Bempton or Rathlin in Northern Ireland. And these are some of our most important, some of our most fantastic places. I think it was, I think it might have been Bill Oddie who said that they were the UK Serengeti. And that's absolutely right. When you go, I was at Falshoek last summer, and just the sound, the sight, and actually the smell of a seabird colony is just amazing. Smell less so, but everything else, I mean, it's all part of that experience, and that experience is going. I mean, when you look at these numbers. To bring it into perspective, here's a map of Shetland. The red dots are where you've seen a percentage change in our seabird numbers and seabird colonies, and between half and almost all of them having gone. So we're seeing really huge declines. And at the moment, this is right cutting edge on the science of what we can do, because it is a global problem as well. So the monitoring has been critical, and you can see here the RSPB has been doing a lot of monitoring of seabird colonies, doing the counts. It's the only way we can recognise what the overall impact of the decline of HPAI on seabird colonies are. And when I was up in Scotland last year, we had 3 or 4 people monitoring the seabird cliffs all day as this person was. Also going round the colonies, weighing the birds here on a gannet colony to see what the impact is, not just on those birds that obviously are dying and the numbers, but on birds, whether they're surviving or not. Monitoring numbers using technology here, drone monitoring, it would be impossible otherwise, but taking photographs of seabird colonies and then doing the counts from photographs. One piece of good news that was recognised, looking at this gannet, you can see that it's got a black iris rather than the usual coloured iris, and it looks as though those birds that have survived avian influenza then develop this black iris. We have no idea why, but it at least gives us hope that some birds are becoming immune and that we can reverse those trends. But of course, our seabirds are under other significant pressure as well, and particularly one of the reasons when you look back at that chart why birds like kittiwake have declined and puffins have declined, it's because of prey species. These are sand eels. Sand eels are the primary prey for many of our birds. Here, roseate tern, again, puffin. See classic picture of puffin with its beak full of sand eels. And much of the monitoring that we've been doing is that as sand eel numbers have declined, so puffins have been catching other fish, things like pipefish, which aren't digestible for the young, for the pufflings. So the survival rate of young is much lower, and you're seeing declines of many of those colonies as well. So the driver of that has been pretty much the intensive sand eel fisheries that have gone on in the UK waters. Mostly, I have to say, not by UK boats, but by Danish boats. And that's one of the reasons why kittiwakes have declined, why we've seen places like this. This again is Falsheugh, you know, the numbers going down. We've been monitoring. You can see 2 of the scientists here actually catching the birds off the cliffs or abseiling down the cliffs. So I mean, some of the work that goes on, the field work, has been, you know, exceptional and exceptionally dangerous, I would say, though I'm sure everything is, you know, health and safety compliant, as it would be. We haven't lost anybody. Bringing the birds up, marking the birds and putting geolocators on them in order to find out where foraging areas are. And you can see here the tracking that's gone on for 4 years between 2010 and 2014, not just around sand eel fisheries, but of course many of these areas are being marked for wind farms and offshore wind as well. And we know that we need offshore wind, we need on-land wind as well if we're going to have renewable energy to replace fossil fuels and mitigate climate change. But we absolutely don't want to address climate and then drive species like kittiwake and puffin to extinction. This map on the left-hand side is the coastal area off Benton particularly. So this is Yorkshire, east coast of Yorkshire. And you can see when you look at the next map what's happening. So these are the hot spots. These maps on the left and right show the hotspots for sand eel fishing. The orange areas on the right-hand side are the intensive sand eel fishery areas, and you can see St Abbs Head, Flamborough and Filey and Bempton's there as well. All of those areas are some of our biggest and most important seabird colonies. And the graph on the lower left shows you what's happening with kittiwake productivity. Science and evidence is really important, not just for the direct conservation of species, but also because it then informs much of the policy work. And policy and campaigning has been at the heart of the work that the RSPB's done since it was founded in 1889. We began as a campaigning organisation around the feathers that were used in the millinery trade, and It took from 1889 to 1921 before the Plumage Act was brought in by Parliament that prevented the importation of feathers from birds for hats. RSPB has been working on trying to end the industrial sand eel fishery for the last 25 years, nearly as long as the RSPB worked on the millinery trade and the Plumage Act to get it in. And the good news, and I want to finish this first half of the talk on some good news, is that finally the UK government has agreed to close our inshore waters, both in England and Scotland, to sand eel fishery. There is now real hope that many of our birds, like puffin, like kittiwake, all under threat anyway from avian influenza, at least some of the pressure from the prey species has been taken off. So a lot of what I've talked about is in here, the RSPB Saving Nature in 2022. It's online, you can look at it. 23 will be coming out soon, but many of those stories and others are in here. Clearly, the breaking news that government has at least closed those sand eel fisheries. Yes, it's inshore, but nevertheless, many birds like puffin, we can see the recovery of those fisheries. And I hope we'll see the recovery of some of our most important species, like puffin and kittiwake. So I'm going to finish there for this first half, almost on time, just a bit early, and hand over, Sue, to you for the break.
Kevin, thank you. Thank you for your lovely glowing words about Renton. We all miss him very much. Thank you for that. A lot of that was very encouraging. A lot of it was rather dismal, but it's nice to finish on a positive note. Thank you so much. I certainly haven't seen greenfinches and chaffinches in my garden for 2 or 3 years. I just miss that song in the summer. I just don't hear it anymore. Anyway, thank you very much then. We'll break for 10 minutes and we'll be back very soon. Thank you.
Thank you all. And I should just say, as another positive note, we didn't have any greenfinches at home for years. And then 3 years ago, they started coming back and they're now in good numbers. So as with avian influenza, I hope that what we're seeing is immunity and natural immunity occurring, and that we can now start to see recovery of many of the species. So let me move on, I'm afraid, to another seabird. There's a long-tailed duck here. Just some work that we've been working with BirdLife partners in the Baltic. Every year at the moment, 400,000 sea ducks are killed by gill nets. It's an absolute ecological disaster. And what we've been trying to do to look at ways of seeing whether we can scare the ducks away from the nets. And one of the trials has been with these what are called floating eyes. So it's a buoy with a couple of eyes on there to try to keep the birds away. So this is where, science, we know the problem. You've just seen the problem. It's around fishing. You can either stop people fishing, as we've done with the sand eel fisheries, or you can accept that fishing will carry on, that there is a demand for it. It's extremely hard to stop it, but look for ways to mitigate its impact. One of the solutions that's been tested are these buoys, the floating eye buoys. Sadly, there is at the moment, no evidence that they work. So we are still seeing significant numbers of sea ducks being killed each year by the fishing industry, particularly in the Baltic. And we're going to have to try some new ways. But I think with science, it's around testing. And then even if something doesn't work, learning from that, moving on and trying something else. So we're not giving up on this. It's just that this was not a solution that specifically worked. I wanted to now talk about another seabird in trouble, also from fishing industry, albatross. This is a photo I took many years ago in the Galapagos. These are waved albatross. Probably one of the highlights for me of birding was seeing these two massive goose-sized birds, bill clacking, displaying within feet of you, completely oblivious, as many of the birds in the Galapagos, most of the birds in the Galapagos are. This is yellow-nosed albatross. I haven't seen these. It's not my photograph. And this is white-chinned petrel. These are all birds that are under significant threat from long-line fisheries. Some of these lines are kilometres long, being put out in areas where albatross obviously fish. The hooks go down, the birds dive, they get caught on the hook, and obviously then they're drowned. And you know, an albatross can live for 70 years. It can take a moment for a bird like that, a magnificent bird, to be drowned. And because they are slow breeders, it's a long time for many of those colonies to recover. But working again with BirdLife partners around the world, we've been looking at solutions for this. You can see here these yellow bird scaring lines are being put onto the lines as they go out with the hooks on. There's also another solution which we're trialling off the coast of South Africa, the hook pod, where the hook doesn't open out until it's below the water. Obviously, there's a cost involved in this. The bird scaring lines are much cheaper, and both have been shown to reduce the number of albatross being killed by the lines, though there are still losses, and we still must do something to make sure that these fisheries are both sustainable and not having the impact on species like albatross and petrel. I mean, the good news is, and I'm going to come on to the economics of this, you know, in many of these places, fishing is what is, you know, big industry, and this is in Namibia, but we're also finding that there is an economic value in putting the bird scaring lines on. So the women in coastal areas are creating the bird scaring lines and then adding them to the fishing lines. So there is an economic value in doing this mitigation work. And we're also putting here Sam and Titus from our Namibian partner. They are both working on the albatross task force and spending a lot of time on the boats, training people, showing them how to use the bird scaring lines and the hook pods, and working with them. Remember, the fishermen themselves don't want to catch albatross, because every time they catch an albatross, that's a fish they haven't caught. There's no economic value in killing albatross. So they will work with the albatross task force in order to mitigate their own losses as well as the losses of albatross. You know, but it's an expensive operation to have people on the boats. It adds to the cost of the fishery just to put the bird scaring lines on. So there are many challenges on this, but at least we are seeing that the losses of albatross have significantly reduced since we've worked out what it is that we can do to mitigate the losses. Another bird where there is significant loss is this. It's a male hen harrier. You will know, and I'll be very brief about the story, but many of the reasons for the declines of some species are not just because of human intervention, which has where the birds are a bycatch of other industries. But here, sadly, is a female hen harrier, where because there is an industry which many cases, not in all, but in many cases sees the hen harrier as a threat, we are seeing significant losses still of hen harriers, despite the fact that obviously it's both illegal, but illegal persecution goes on, and there is clear evidence, because we do the monitoring, that it is mostly related to shooting interest, particularly driven grouse shooting. And it is as much not just because the predation of grouse by hen harriers, but also the disturbance on shoot days. So without the RSPB's monitoring team and then the work that we do to bring that and bring that to light and communicate to people, I think those losses of many of our species would go on. Which I talked about goshawk slightly earlier, and here was a case where a gamekeeper had poisoned 5 goshawk that were just found dumped. So there are some egregious cases of raptor persecution, and they are still going on related to driven grouse shooting and in other areas around lowland game shooting, which is one of the reasons, again, on the policy side, RSPB, with the evidence, is calling for a change to shooting and asking for government to license both driven grouse shooting and lowland game shooting. Unless licensing comes in, I'm afraid I think we will still continue to see persecution happening. So I'm going to move you now away from that, actually to a bit of a better news story, not related to the work of the RSPB directly, but to a BirdLife partner. RSPB is the BirdLife partner in the UK, work that I've been involved with for the last 14 years through World Land Trust, working with Armenia, the BirdLife partner in Bolivia. So you're looking here, obviously at South America and the Beni province in Bolivia. Trinidad down here is the main town of Beni department. It's an area, I think 2-3 times the size of Portugal, a vast area, mostly open savanna. It's wetland, it's very flat, with areas around the wetland area of slightly higher ground trees, with birds like this. These are black skimmers, woodstock, one of the prettiest birds, I always think. Some more of them. This is Plumbeus ibis, again, lovely bird. Lovely little American kestrel, and if I can remember rightly, this is a red-rumped seed eater. So these are savanna birds. This is a grassland bird, and most of this is grassland. But in many of the places across that savanna, it's seeing the same degradation as many other grassland areas, increasingly being ploughed up, reseeded with African grasses, which are of absolutely no use to endemic species, of a lot of fire. So the grass is burnt regularly, it's uncontrolled burning, so vast areas become burnt, and of course then become useless for as habitat and ecosystems. But there are these forest islands, and in many cases they are overgrazed. This is all cattle grazing country, which is why the grass is being burnt regularly to refresh it. But these islands exist within the savanna. It seems that they are built on old villages from pre-Columbian times, so they're slightly raised above the water table because they were villages and very often used as middens as well. So it raised up the soil level, and now, of course, it's more fertile and the trees have grown up. And this, in the middle, you can see the palm trees. These are motoku palms, which is the nut of the motoku palm feeds this bird, which is the blue-throated macaw. It's an endemic Bolivian macaw. The rarest macaw existing in the wild. There are rarer macaws, of course, like Spix's macaw, which have just been re-released into the wild. There are populations, of course, in the pet trade, and one of the threats to blue-throated macaw was always collection of chicks for the pet trade, and there were no protected areas for them. So one of the things that we worked with through World Land Trust with Armenia was to buy a large ranch, 5,000 acres of Beni province, and turn that into a blue-throated macaw reserve. What at the time we didn't know was where the birds were nesting. They didn't seem to be nesting on the reserve, but it's been discovered since that actually they will take to nest boxes, a bit like the pied flycatchers I was talking about earlier. So now a lot of work is going into putting up nest boxes for the macaws, and we're seeing numbers increase from a low of 20 years ago, where it was thought that there were as few as 150 blue-throated macaws still left in the wild, all in two populations, one north of Trinidad and a smaller one south of Trinidad. And now those numbers have doubled over the last 10 years, primarily because there's protected habitat. The savanna is allowed to grow up, the palms are protected from overgrazing, and the nest boxes have encouraged them. The other thing is engaging with the local community, because one of the biggest threats to macaws was the fact that they were used in headdresses for traditional ceremonies. And each of these headdresses would take as many as 15 macaws to supply the feathers for the headdress. What you're looking at here is a headdress that no macaw was harmed to make. So Armonia, working with local people, created a pride project so that people understood that this was a really rare bird, only found in this area around Trinidad in Beni province, and giving people a sense of how rare and how special it was, and then working with them to find alternative substitutes to using real macaw feathers. Everything looking at here is a headdress made out of painted silk. So people are now moving to use these, still continuing with many of the traditional ceremonies, but no longer killing macaws to do so. There's also been monitoring by local people of markets to ensure that the macaw trade is caught and stopped. So many of the reasons, and I'm going to come on to a different sort of science in a moment, social science, because unless you get the people on side, it's extremely hard for conservation organisations on their own to reverse the declines of many species. This, I believe, is a really good news story. The reserve itself has doubled in size since we first set it up 12 years ago. Land prices are going up all the time, so it's really important to protect the land and to know about the species there as well. So I want to quickly move to a completely different part of the world. This is the Balkans, this is Bulgaria, and this bird, this is the Egyptian vulture, again, a migrant under huge pressure from a whole range of problems, from power lines, from poisoning, from shooting, from and numbers have decreased significantly and disappeared from a whole range of areas. So the monitoring has been going on for the last 10 years. The identification of the problem, so the diagnosis phase has happened, and the birds have been tagged to monitor them on migration as well to find out what's happening. But one of the key interventions has been to take the birds, some of the birds, into captivity and to start to breed from them in captivity. Again, testing a solution to the birds so that we can protect them, and we then can start to build numbers. So even though not all of the threats have been eradicated, nevertheless, it's possible to increase the numbers. There will still be losses to power lines, to shooters and so on, but overall, we're going to put more birds out there. And you can see, I mean, here from Green Balkans, one of the partners working on this project, working on the breeding birds in captivity program. And here is one of the young Egyptian vultures soon after release. So it's a good news story, but we're certainly not in that phase where I would say there's a long-term legacy. These are still birds under significant threat, and they are rare. And while we're talking about vultures, I'll take you to India. This is Delhi. This is what you would have seen just 40 years ago in Delhi. This is a photograph of vultures at one of the dumps, the feeding dumps in Delhi. These were the cleanup birds of the area. Since then, there has been, since by 2007, so in that very short 20-year period, most of those birds have gone. nearly to the point of extinction, 99.9% decline of vultures in the Indian subcontinent. And what's happened since then is that actually you've seen feral dog numbers increase, and that has been, not just dreadful for spread of disease, for dog attacks and for rabies, but the cleaning that the vultures did is not done in the same way by packs of feral dogs. So there's not just been an impact on a really important species, but also an impact on people living close by as well. So some of those declines, you can see it's happened across both the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia. Most of it, has been unintentional poisoning, either because baits have been put out for other species, things like rats, of course, but also unintentional poisoning from vet meds as well. So, and particularly some of these vet meds which are used on cattle. Cattle, of course, in India are sacred. As they start to get ill, the first thing that happens, very often too late, is that many of these vet meds are used. And what it was discovered was that this is the reason when the vultures come in and eat dead cows, dead cattle, the vultures were dying because of that. And again, that's where the science was really important, because nobody knew why these declines of vultures were happening and happening so quickly. And had we not identified the problem, it's almost certain that vulture species across Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asia would have gone extinct. So again, testing these and looking at some of those vet meds and why that they have had this devastating impact on vultures. And you can see here a list of some of those drugs and the toxicity and what's happened. Not all of them have been banned. The diclofenac, which some of you might know anyway, because you can take it here for things like gout. Again, it's an anti-inflammatory. Most of these are anti-inflammatories. Has been banned across India, Pakistan, and Nepal, but that's not the only anti-inflammatory drug that's being used for veterinary purposes. So there is still a long battle ahead. And again, the way that it was decided that we could, only do this, given that the vet meds were being used so widely, was to take birds into captivity and breed them there and keep them safe until conditions externally were safe. So there were the cages put up. You can see these cages are now open, so birds are in soft release mode. But we still keep birds in captivity and breeding in captivity as well, in case another new drug comes into some of into use and has exactly the same impact as diclofenac and the other anti-inflammatory drugs. So here, tagged birds, so they're being monitored before release. These are birds that are due for release, as I say, soft release, still being fed around the cage, but free to go. And we'll have GPS trackers on them as well. And working in those areas, particularly around Nepal and northern India, we've been working with the Bombay Natural History Society to create these vulture safe zones, in the hope that the birds, provided they don't fly out of them, working with many of the veterinarians in those areas to prevent sale of some of the anti-inflammatories, the most toxic ones, moving people over to using those that have been tested for non-toxicity. So we're seeing here these vulture safe zones, at least giving many of the vultures a chance to come back. But that doesn't mean that they're safe, because exactly the same as I talked about with Egyptian vulture, there are still losses from power infrastructure, from power lines, and from poison baits put out, not specifically for vultures, but for other species, including feral dogs now, because the numbers have grown. So poisoning the dogs, which then poisons the vultures that come in that are still in those areas. So the change that's happened so radically. Anybody who was in India or the Indian subcontinent 40, even 30 years ago, I can still remember I was in Nepal in the 90s, and there were a lot of vultures around, there were a lot of black kites around, and they have pretty much all gone. One of the things I wanted to talk about was that none of our science and none of our conservation happens in isolation. And this gives you an indication of that. A partnership working across countries, across organisations. So the RSPB is just one of the organisations that's working on the Saving Asian Vultures from Extinction programme, the SAVE programme. We could not do it alone. We need the power of partnership to be able to do that, whether it's around the science, the evidence, the monitoring, or the interventions, the work that goes on to protect these species, and we hope to lead to their recovery. And I just want to quickly pay tribute to this man in the middle who works for the RSPB. He lives in India. He's lived in India for decades, a man called Chris Bowden, and he has really spearheaded the work for the RSPB and the partners on vultures. It's his life's work. If anybody can be said to have saved vultures, certainly in the Indian subcontinent, it's Chris, and here he is talking to two senior members of the Indian Parliament. So it isn't just about the science, it is about communicating the messages and getting the policy changes embedded that will lead to better outcomes. So I hope that will happen. I hope it will happen for Chris, but more than anything, I hope it happens for the people in the Indian subcontinent and for the vultures themselves. So just towards the end, I want to talk about another area where the RSPB has been involved for the last 20 plus years, since I think 2000, so nearly a quarter of a century. This bird, which I've never seen, it's on my list. This is white-necked Picathartes, and it lives in, it's a bird that breeds around rocky habitat in the forests of West Africa. We're here in Sierra Leone in the Gola rainforest, where the RSPB has been working with the Sierra Leone BirdLife partner and with the Sierra Leone government for that time. Even during the civil war there, RSPB was still involved in this project, saving the Gola rainforest from the same sort of destruction that has happened across West Africa and increasingly across many of the other areas of Africa. Some of the ways of doing that, of course, are economic. So it isn't just here. People are collecting, doing the monitoring around carbon sequestration within the forest, and the economic value of that carbon is increasing. And one of the ways that we are going to save the forest is by making it more valuable to keep it intact than chopping it down. And that's where working with local people, working with partners, there is an economic benefit to keeping the forest intact. But it is also about the monitoring. These guys are out along one of the rivers in the Gola rainforest, putting out camera traps for pygmy hippo. This is not just a place for some amazing birds, but pygmy hippo, chimpanzee, whole range of species. So learning about putting up camera traps, monitoring them, monitoring absolutely is key to this, as well as employment for local people in conservation and not just in other areas. But one of the key other economic drivers of this area is cacao. So there's chocolate coming out of here. I'd encourage you, if you haven't already, to go to the RSPB website, buy your chocolate from there. It's produced in the Gola rainforest. Every bar you buy is saving a bit of rainforest. So working with the local communities to grow cacao beans for chocolate, and that's delivering schools which weren't there before, so the money is going back into the local community, and to hospitals. So you're seeing that the local community is benefiting both from working for conservation, keeping the forest, but also seeing ways, particularly around the periphery, of having an economic benefit coming from it. So I want to talk now just briefly before I finish about, you know, social science. Now we know turtle dove is our most threatened migrant at the moment. The declines have been 97% over the last 30 years. We've seen an incredible decline, a retraction in its range. What you can see here, the black dots are where there are still turtle doves to be found. So little hotspots, particularly around East Kent, a bit going up into East Anglia and some as far north as Yorkshire. But actually the western ones, we get the occasional one in Devon, Haldon Forest, but confirmed breeding is, I don't know, I haven't seen them there. But the most important thing is actually encouraging people to get out, to talk to farmers, to talk about the habitat, exactly the same as we saw earlier with Cirl Bunting. It's people that will save this bird. It's not just, you know, our love of that bird, the love of hearing a turtle dove in the summer and missing it when it's gone, but it's getting people on side and training people to go out, to talk to farmers, talk to landowners about what they can do. And we are in some of those areas like East Kent seeing numbers of turtle doves increase. Of course, there are many other threats. There are threats from when they're on migration, from hunting, from shooting, from trapping. There are threats when they're in Africa during the winter from shooting, but we've got to do things here, and that means getting people on side. And exactly the same with this. So I took this up in Shetland, middle of last year, again communicating with people about the impact that we as people can have, particularly on ground nesting birds. You won't be surprised at the number of people who, you know, when I go up on Dartmoor and I see during the breeding season dogs, in many cases, you know, half a dozen dogs commercially walked up there. And when you talk to people, they're completely oblivious that there are ground nesting birds, because after all, we all know birds nest in trees. Getting this message across, monitoring the birds, but most of all, talking to people, explaining to people. Our social science is critical in the way that we get those messages across. And I hope get people on side and feeling, like I talked about in Bolivia, feeling proud to have little terns nesting on your beach and recognizing that we have a duty to protect them, not just for ourselves and for the birds, but for future generations as well. And for that, I also want to talk about future generations and the birds in our garden and big garden birdwatch and the importance, you know, of what is one of the most, you know, significant events in the RSPB's calendar, is getting people who would not otherwise think about looking at the birds in the garden, monitoring those birds, and getting next generations really, really engaged with bird watching, bringing young people through and giving them a sense of the excitement that we've all had from watching birds, of growing up with them, of living with them, and knowing that birds are in decline, but all of us have a duty to protect them. Now, I know that there is, because, you know, I talk to a lot of birders, and there's a bit of cynicism about big garden birdwatch. Oh, it's just a marketing thing. Oh, you know, it's not proper science. Well, you know, it's been going for long enough that it is, I honestly can tell you, it is proper science. We are learning things from it. Yes, it's citizen science, but getting people engaged. And one of its key benefits is allowing people who wouldn't otherwise think about bird watching to spend an hour every year sitting in their gardens, sitting in their kitchens, watching the birds coming in and monitoring them. That can be something that stays with them for life. All of us were young once, and something triggered that love of nature. So if you do nothing, go and find a young person and make sure that you do big garden bird watch. It does have a scientific value, but it also, I think, has a significant value for people as well. So that's me finished. I'm very happy to take questions. I just want to finish with this photograph. This photograph, which you may or may not recognise, is Periglis Bay on St Agnes. It's probably, and I want to bring it full circle, it's the place where I would probably not have gone without Renton encouraging me. Renton loved Scilly more than any other place in the world, probably even more than many of the places in Berkshire, I'm sorry to say. You know, he first went there when he was 15, and he went there in the last year of his life. He went multiple times a year. I spent many happy weeks with him on St Agnes, birding with him, just walking around, you know, seeing things, just and one of the great things that I know gave him real pleasure was the fact that St Agnes, which he loved so much, it became rat free in the last 5-6 years. And that was a project which RSPB, working with the Isles of Scilly Wildlife Trust and others, led. And now, Manx Shearwater, which I started with, and the monitoring of Manx Shearwater, the acoustic monitoring, are now back breeding on St Agnes on Scilly. And there are plans to continue the rat eradication project on other islands, particularly Tresco and Briar as well. I know that that would have given Renton particularly enormous pleasure to know that Scilly, the birds were coming back. So to finish on a positive note, I thought I'd leave you with one of my favourite places now, this beach where I've seen so many birds, curlew, sandpiper to sanderling, whole range of species. I've grown to love Scilly, I've grown to love St Agnes, and I have Renton to thank for that. So thank you all very much. Thank you for listening. I always think, you know, what we're doing, you know, you as part of Berkshire Ornithological Club and everybody involved, whether it's monitoring, whether it's volunteering, whether it's becoming a member, and I hope you all are, of the RSPB, of course, whether it's, you know, donating to the RSPB's work, whatever we do, we have to do our bit, because this is probably the most important thing, the reversing nature's decline, leading to nature recovery, I think is really the challenge of our time. So thank you all. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for listening.
Kevin, thank you. Whatever your wife says, I could listen to you all night, and I'm sure everybody else feels the same. There's so much that I didn't realise that I didn't know. There's just so much, and it's also lovely to know how many people actually do care and are educating others and being educated. That was absolutely wonderful, and I'm sure some people here must have some questions, or maybe somebody online has some questions. Yes.
Oh, yeah, it's both about the bittern.
Yeah.
You actually started to have 11 pairs,
11 pairs of breeding pairs of Bittern, yes.
Did all the subsequent birds, they all got the same genetic, they all from the same pair? The birds that subsequently been bred.
Right. Kevin, are you there?
Yeah, I am, but I couldn't hear, I'm afraid.
Me, yeah, okay. But the question was, the 11 breeding pairs of Bitterns, did they all, you're saying, come from those 11 pairs, the numbers that are on up now to?
No. What's happened is that by creating the right sort of conditions, wetlands, what we've seen is birds coming over from the continent, which have boosted numbers significantly. So since a lot of those birds, of course, have bred here, but we are also seeing birds coming over from the continent, which have, so there's a lot of genetic diversity has come in. So, and that's one of the problems you've seen in other populations of different species. When they become relict populations, there is every chance that you get genetic bottlenecking. And I think that in Scotland, for example, at the moment on some of the Scottish Isles, chough are in real trouble. And a lot of the reason for that is that the genetics now have led to inbreeding. And unless we can find ways of bringing other birds in, we may see the extinction of chough as a breeding bird in Scotland very soon.
That's very sad.
But it's a piece of work that RSPB and others are working on, but recognising the problem allows us then to find ways to address it.
It's just wonderful the way so many people do care and that we're putting so much into all of this, isn't it? It's just so encouraging. Anybody else?
Ian's got a question on Zoom.
Okay, so Ian Oldcorn has a question on Zoom for us.
Thank you. Kevin, the RSPB started as a UK organisation, but it is now obviously an international force. Broadly speaking, how does the RSPB decide how to allocate its funds between UK projects and overseas activities?
Really interesting question. So we have an international strategy that concentrates primarily on, again, UK birds, but we know that birds don't respect borders, and many of our most threatened birds, of course, are migrants. So much of our international work concentrates on working with partners in those countries where the migrants go, which is one of the reasons why we're working in West Africa. We know that a lot of our summer migrants are overwintering in West Africa, but working along the flyways. So we're now working all the way from Iceland all the way down to Sierra Leone and Liberia in West Africa, and working on that flyway, many cases with BirdLife partners. The other area that we're working internationally is around the UK overseas territories. So, and many of the species that we're working with, including, of course, albatross and some of the petrels that I talked about, breed on UK overseas territories. So the threats from longline fishing are, as much a threat to our UK birds, particularly, some of the larger long-lived birds, and around fishing, around non-native invasive species, particularly rats, mice on many of the islands. So we look at work around the UK overseas territories. And then finally, I suppose, there are what I would call legacy projects, like the Indian vulture species that I talked about, where the threat is so acute that had we not stepped in and worked, given the scientific resource that we had, worked with our Indian partners particularly, I think we would have seen the extinction of most of those species. So there is what I would call triage work as well, where without RSPB, it would be almost impossible for those species to survive. The other area working internationally, of course, is as a BirdLife partner. So although we might not directly be working in certain countries, Bolivia I talked about, we don't have any projects working with South American partners. That's working both within South America and in North America, in USA and Canada particularly. Nevertheless, as a significant partner of BirdLife, we do a lot of work and share science, share a lot of resource through BirdLife. Around 10% of RSPB's funding, of its income, goes on international projects. Is that right? It's almost, you can't tell. The need is so great everywhere. We'd like to be able to double that amount, but it's about resource allocation and where we can most usefully make the contribution towards species recovery.
Thank you, Kevin. I think sometimes, though, you spend so much time advertising how well you're doing overseas that we don't actually know where the 90% or so goes on the UK side. Thank you.
I hope I've given you a little bit of a few of the stories that, and look, we have the largest, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about science was because the RSPB has the largest conservation science team of any organisation, including universities in the country. And the difference, of course, is that our conservation scientists are looking for solutions that can be applied. So if you go to an RSPB reserve, the reason you're going to see significant numbers of species, including red list and threatened species, is because sitting behind that is a team of ecologists who translate the science, the scientific research that's been done by over 60 conservation science working in the RSPB Centre for Conservation Science, into applied science that then delivers the conservation outcomes on the ground on now 224 reserves. So I'd say actually get out and look at the reserves and you can see science in action. And like the example of Bittern or Cirl Bunting, we can't save all species on our reserves, but many of those are places that are real hotspots for threatened species because of the work that translates research science into applied science through ecology into people who end up digging ditches and planting reed beds.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Anybody here in the room? Yes.
Comparable organisations to the RSPB in mainland Europe. So does Europe?
I can't quite hear you. I'm sorry. I can't.
Spain, France, Italy, are there comparable organisations to the RSPB out there?
Are there similar organisations in Spain and France as we have here, like the RSPB?
There are, and there are organisations like the RSPB in each of those countries, in pretty much every European country. They are BirdLife partners. We work closely with them. I should say that the RSPB is much the largest European conservation organisation. And that's thanks to you, thanks to me, thanks to all of us, because there is a real enthusiasm for conservation and for birds here, which in many places in Europe just doesn't seem to translate into the membership of some of our, some of their important conservation organisations. So even in a country like Germany, the NABU, the equivalent of the RSPB there, is about 1/10 of the size. So that we do punch above our weight as a country, certainly even post Brexit, through BirdLife in Europe and working with European partners. But we work very closely with a whole range of partners, supporting them, building capacity with them, and sharing much of the science where they don't necessarily have the capacity. We are sharing a lot of the science that I've talked about with others across Europe, and you will see exactly the same recovery of species like Bittern in places like the Netherlands because of the work that's been done here.
Right, thank you. Okay. If there's no more questions, all I can do is thank you again. I'm really glad, Kevin, that I bumped into you at Renton's memorial service last year and I asked you whether you would give us a talk and you agreed to do this. And I'm so glad because it's been really riveting and I'm sure we've all really enjoyed it. Everybody here and everybody at home. A lot of people watching at home on Zoom as well, which is good. So thank you very much again, and can we all thank Kevin so much for giving up his time and giving us this fabulous talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kevin.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's been a delight. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you, but it's great that we can do this on Zoom. And thank you all so much for listening, but also all of your support, and both for obviously for Berkshire and conservation there, but for the RSPB and for conservation more generally. It really matters.
Oh, thank you. You've been very gracious. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Just leaves me to remind everybody here about the bird nest scheme talk, which is in 2 weeks' time with Lee Barber. And just to clarify the photographic competition categories, flight or action is the other category. So in other words, if the bird's flying or some sort of action that it's doing, I don't know anymore how I can clarify it any more than that, but flight or action and portrait. And what's the other category, Jane? Birds in Berkshire. That's the pardon? They can be doing anything, yeah, birds in Berkshire. Okay, so I hope that's clear for everybody. Okay, so hopefully we'll see some of you back here next week, those at home. But thank you for joining us at home, and thank you for everybody coming here tonight. And we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.